Commander Lyra Vance stood alone in the communication room of the medical frigate, Mercy's Edge. The ship was quiet at this hour. Most of the crew was sleeping. Only the soft hum of the engines kept her company as she watched the stars. Through the small window, Lyra was a military medic. She had spent 15 years saving lives on battlefields and disaster zones. Her hands had pulled soldiers from burning wreckage. Her voice had calmed dying patients in their final moments. She had seen the worst things the galaxy could offer, and she had never looked away. Tonight was supposed to be peaceful. The Mercy's Edge was on routine patrol near the contested rim, a region of space where no empire held power. There was nothing here but empty planets and ancient trade routes. Nothing ever happened in the contested rim. Then the signal came. It started as static on her console. Lyra almost ignored it. But something made her stop. Something made her listen. She adjusted the frequency and leaned closer to the speaker. A voice emerged from the noise. It was weak and filled with fear. The words were in Veloxi, a language Lyra had learned during her training. The Veluxi were an amphibian species known for their peaceful nature and beautiful underwater cities. They had no military. They had no enemies. They simply existed in harmony with the galaxy. The voice belonged to a Veluxi elder. He was begging for help. Lyra translated his words in her mind. A sickness had come to their world. People were dying in the streets. Children were collapsing in their schools. The hospitals were full, and the doctors had no cure. The poison was spreading through the air, through the water, through everything, and then the elder said something that made Lyra's blood turn cold. The sickness was not natural. It was a weapon. The Kreth Dominion had released it upon their world. The Kreth wanted the Veluxi to surrender their planet. If they refused, everyone would die. Lyra saved the recording and rushed to the bridge. Captain Oren was a good man, a careful man. He would know what to do. She found him reviewing navigation charts and played the message for him. His face grew serious as he listened. When the recording ended, Captain Oren was silent for a long moment. Then he shook his head. The Veluxi were not part of the coalition. Sending ships to help them would violate the neutrality treaties. The Kreth would see it as an act of war. Command would never approve such a mission. Their hands were tied. Lyra argued with him. She told him about the children dying in the streets. She reminded him of their oath as medical officers. They had sworn to save lives without asking about politics or borders. How could they ignore a cry for help? Captain Oren looked at her with sad eyes. He agreed with everything she said. But he was a captain, and captains had to think about their crew. If he sent the Mercy's Edge into Kreth territory, his people would die. He could not make that choice. He ordered Lyra to delete the recording and return to her quarters. The matter was closed, but Lyra did not delete the recording. Instead, she went to her quarters and began searching through the intercepted Kreth communications. She had access to these files as a senior medical officer. The information was meant to help them prepare for biological threats. What she found changed everything. The Kreth always carried the antidote to their weapons. It was standard protocol. After a planet surrendered, they would cure the population and claim them as servants. The antidote was kept aboard their command vessels, locked in secure medical vaults. The Kreth fortress ship Ironbound was orbiting Vilar Prime right now. The cure was inside that fortress. Thousands of lives were locked behind those metal walls. Lyra sat on her bed and stared at the wall. She thought about her life. She thought about her career. She thought about all the people she had saved over the years. Then she thought about the Veluxi children who would never grow up. If no one helped them, she had always believed in something simple. When you see someone suffering, you help them. You do not ask permission. You do not wait for orders. You simply act. That was what it meant to be human. The Coalition would not send ships. Captain Oren could not risk his crew. The Veluxi had no one coming to save them. No one except her. Lyra stood up and began packing a small bag. She took medical supplies, a portable scanner, and emergency rations. She did not take any weapons. She was a healer, not a soldier. Besides, Weapons would not help her where she was going. She walked through the silent corridors of the Mercies Edge until she reached the shuttle bay. A small medical transport sat waiting in the darkness. It was designed for rescue missions, fast and quiet. Perfect for what she needed. Lyra disabled her tracking beacon and climbed into the pilot's seat. Her hands trembled slightly as she activated the engines. She was not afraid of dying. She was afraid of failing. If she did not reach that antidote in time, thousands of innocent people would suffer. She was not good enough. But fear had never stopped her before. The shuttle lifted off the deck and slipped through the bay doors into open space. The Mercy's Edge grew smaller behind her as she set course for Velar Prime. Ahead, the stars burned cold and distant. Somewhere among them, the Kreth fortress waited like a dark spider in its web. Lyra took a deep breath and pushed the engines to full power. She did not know if she would survive this mission. She did not know if she would ever see her crew again. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would rather die trying to save lives than live knowing she had done nothing. The medical shuttle vanished into the darkness between stars. Behind her, the Mercy's Edge continued its patrol, unaware that one of its own had just started a chain of events that would change the galaxy forever. On the surface of Velar Prime, a Velutsi mother held her sick child and prayed for a miracle. She did not know that a human woman was flying toward her at impossible speeds. She did not know that hope was coming wrapped in the uniform of a military medic. All she knew was that her child was dying, and no one seemed to care. But someone did care. Someone was coming. And that someone was willing to risk everything for strangers she had never met. That was the human way, the distress signal that made humanity fearless. She seized their fortress before the antidote Part 2. The Kreth fortress ship Ironbound filled Lyra's viewport like a metal mountain floating in space. She had never seen anything so large or so terrifying. The fortress was built from black iron and sharp angles, designed to make conquered worlds tremble at the sight of it. Weapon platforms covered its surface like thorns on a dark flower. Patrol ships circled it like hungry insects. Lyra slowed her shuttle and studied the massive structure. She was a single woman in a tiny medical transport. The fortress held thousands of Kreth warriors. Every logical part of her brain told her to turn around and go home, but logic had never been her strongest quality. Compassion was. She scanned the fortress for weak points. The main hangars were too well guarded. The weapon platforms would destroy her before she got close. But there, on the lower section of the hull, she spotted something promising. A maintenance shaft used for waste disposal. It was small, dirty, completely beneath the notice of the Kreth commander's perfect. Lyra guided her shuttle into the shadow of a nearby asteroid and powered down all non-essential systems. She needed to approach slowly, using only minimum power. The Kreth bioscanners were sophisticated, but they were designed to detect large threats. A single human with a controlled heartbeat might slip through unnoticed. She ate a small meal and practiced her breathing exercises. Her medical training had taught her how to calm her body in stressful situations. Slow breaths, steady heartbeat, clear mind. She repeated these words like a prayer as she drifted toward the fortress. The maintenance shaft was even smaller than it appeared on her scans. Lyra had to remove her outer jacket just to fit inside. The tunnel was dark and filled with the smell of processed waste. She crawled through the filth without complaint. She had worked in worse conditions during plague outbreaks. A little dirt was nothing compared to the lives at stake, after what felt like hours. She emerged into the lower decks of the fortress. The corridors were dimly lit and mostly empty. This section was used for storage and machinery. The Kreth soldiers had no reason to patrol here. Lyra moved quickly and quietly, staying close to the walls and listening for footsteps. The Kreth were insectoid beings. Tall and covered in hard shells the color of dried blood. They had 4 arms and mandibles that clicked when they spoke. Their culture valued strength and dominance above all else. To them, the weak existed only to serve the strong. Compassion was a sign of failure. Mercy was a weakness to be punished. They could not understand why any creature would risk death for strangers. Such behavior made no sense in their world. That confusion might be the only advantage Lyra had. She found a computer terminal and accessed the fortress schematics. The antidote vault was located on the medical level, 3 decks above her current position. Security was heavy around that area. She would need to find another way up. As she studied the map, a sound made her freeze. Footsteps were approaching. Light footsteps, not the heavy march of soldiers. Lyra pressed herself into a dark corner and held her breath. A young Kreth appeared from around the corner. He was smaller than the warriors she had seen in recordings. His shell was a lighter color, and his movements were nervous and uncertain. He wore the simple uniform of a technician, not a soldier. He was carrying a repair kit and muttering to himself in the Kreth language. Then he saw her. Lyra expected him to scream. She expected him to call for guards. Instead, he simply stood there, frozen in surprise. His 4 arms hung limply at his sides. His mandibles twitched but made no sound. They stared at each other for a long moment. Lyra saw something in his eyes that she did not expect. Fear, but not fear of her. He was afraid of something else. He was afraid of being caught in this empty corridor, away from his assigned duties. He was afraid of what his commanders would do if they found him. The young Kreth took a step backward. He seemed ready to run, but then he stopped and looked at Lyra more carefully. He noticed her medical insignia. He noticed the healing supplies in her bag. Understanding slowly dawned in his eyes. He did not call for guards. Instead, he spoke in broken but understandable common language. He asked her why she was here. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. Lyra told him the truth. She told him about the dying Veloxi on the surface below. She told him about the children and the families waiting for a cure that was locked inside this fortress. She told him she was not there to fight or to kill. She only wanted to save lives. The young Kreth was silent for a long time. Then he said something that surprised her. He said that not all Kreth wanted this war. Many of the younger generation were tired of conquest and death. They wanted to trade with other species, not destroy them. But speaking against the commanders meant death. So they stayed quiet and obeyed. His name was Kethfor. He was a maintenance engineer assigned to the lower decks. He had never hurt anyone in his life. He had only ever fixed broken machines and dreamed of a different future for his people. Lyra saw an opportunity. She asked him if he would help her. She promised that if she survived, she would tell the galaxy that not all Kreth were monsters. She would tell them about the young ones who wanted peace. Kethfor hesitated. Helping her would mean death if he was caught. But refusing would mean watching more innocent people suffer. He had watched the commanders celebrate when the weapon was deployed. He had seen them laugh at the suffering they caused. That memory haunted him. He agreed to help her, but before they could move, alarms began screaming throughout the fortress. Red lights flashed in the corridors. Soldiers ran past their hiding spot, weapons ready. The fortress communication system crackled to life. The voice of the High Commander echoed through every speaker. A human vessel had been detected near the fortress. They believed it was a rescue mission. All units were to prepare for possible attack. The entire fortress was now on high alert. Lyra realized what had happened. They had found her shuttle. Her only escape route was now surrounded by enemy soldiers. She was trapped inside an enemy fortress with no way out. Kethfor looked at her with wide eyes. He asked what they should do now. Lyra took a deep breath and steadied her nerves. She looked up toward the decks above them, toward the vault that held the antidote. She told him they would continue the mission. She had come too far to turn back. Either she would get that cure, or she would die trying. There was no other option. The distress signal that made humanity fearless. She seized their fortress. Before the antidote Part 3, the fortress trembled with activity as Kreth's soldiers rushed to battle stations. The alarms continued their endless screaming. Red emergency lights painted everything in shades of blood. Somewhere above, commanders were shouting orders and preparing weapons. Lyra and Kethfor moved through the chaos like ghosts. The young Kreth knew every maintenance tunnel and forgotten passage in the lower decks. He led her through darkness and dust, avoiding the main corridors where soldiers marched in formation as they climbed higher into the fortress. Lyra asked Keth4 about the High Commander. She needed to understand her enemy if she wanted any chance of success. Keth4's voice grew cold when he spoke the name. Executor Vryn. He was the most decorated war leader in the Dominion. He had conquered 11 worlds using biological weapons. To him, killing was simply a tool, no different from a hammer or a blade. He felt nothing for the lives he destroyed. They were merely obstacles to be removed. Vryn had been born into a powerful military family. He had never known doubt or mercy. He believed the Kreth were destined to rule the galaxy, and everything he did served that purpose. The attack on Velor Prime was just another routine operation to him. Another world to claim, another species to enslave. Lyra felt disgust rising in her throat, but she pushed it down. Anger would not help her now. Only focus would get her through this alive. They reached the medical level after an hour of climbing through service tunnels. The corridors here were cleaner and better lit. Medical symbols marked the walls in Kreth language. Lyra could smell the sharp scent of disinfectant and chemicals. The antidote vault was at the end of a long hallway. 4 elite soldiers stood guard outside its heavy metal doors. They wore ceremonial armor and carried pulse rifles. Their eyes constantly scanned the corridor for threats. Keth4 whispered that he could access the security panel from a nearby maintenance room. He could disable the locks and open the vault doors. But someone would need to distract the guards first. Lyra looked at the soldiers. They were massive and heavily armed. She was small and carried no weapons. In any physical fight, she would lose instantly. But maybe she did not need to fight them. She remembered something from her training. The Kreth respected strength and despised weakness, but they were also deeply curious about species they considered inferior. A human walking openly toward them would confuse them. They would want to understand how such a weak creature got inside their fortress. That confusion might buy her the time she needed. Lyra took a deep breath and stepped into the corridor. She walked slowly and calmly toward the guards, her hands visible and empty. The soldiers saw her immediately. Their rifles snapped up, aiming at her chest. She stopped a safe distance away and spoke in clear, simple words. She identified herself as Commander Lyra Vance, medical officer of the Human Coalition. She said she was not armed. She said she was not there to fight. The guards exchanged confused glances. Their mandibles clicked rapidly as they communicated in their own language. One of them demanded to know how she got inside. Another asked why she had not been detected earlier. Lyra ignored their questions. Instead, she began talking about the people dying on Velor Prime. She described the Veloxi, children struggling to breathe as the poison filled their lungs. She described the mothers holding their babies and watching them slip away. She described the fathers kneeling beside their families, helpless and broken. The guards shifted uncomfortably. This was not how prisoners were supposed to behave. Prisoners begged for their lives. Prisoners offered information in exchange for mercy. This human was talking about children as if the Kreth should care. One of the guards lowered his rifle slightly. His eyes held something unexpected. Doubt. He had offspring of his own somewhere in the Dominion. For a brief moment, he imagined them sick and dying while strangers refused to help. Behind the guards, Lyra saw the maintenance door open just a crack. Keth4 was in position. She kept talking. She asked the guards if they had ever saved a life. She asked if they had ever held someone's hand while they were afraid. She asked if they had ever felt the simple joy of knowing that someone survived because of them. The guards had no answers. These concepts were foreign to their training. They were soldiers, designed to take lives, not save them. But something in Lyra's voice made them hesitate. Something in her calm certainty made them question everything they had been taught. Then a new voice cut through the corridor like a knife. Executor. Vryn strode toward them with perfect confidence. He was taller than the other Kreth, his shell darker and covered with combat scars. Golden insignia marked his rank. His eyes were cold and intelligent. He stopped before Lyra and studied her with open amusement. He called her brave but foolish. He said humans were known for their emotional weakness, but this was impressive even by their standards. Coming alone into an enemy fortress with no weapons was either very brave or very stupid. Lyra met his gaze without fear. She told him she understood courage better than he ever could. True courage was not the ability to destroy. True courage was the willingness to sacrifice everything for others. Viren laughed. He said the Kreth respected only strength. Her words meant nothing here. She should surrender now, and perhaps he would keep her alive as an interesting specimen. Lyra shook her head. She said he misunderstood humans completely. They were not fearless because they did not feel fear. They were fearless because they acted despite it. Every human knew terror. They simply refused to let it control them. Behind Vryn, the vault doors began to slide open. Kethfor had done his job. The antidote containers glowed softly in the darkness of the vault. Lyra moved before anyone could react. She dove past the guards and rolled into the vault, her hands closing around a container of antidote. In the same motion, she activated her emergency beacon. The signal burst from the fortress and raced across space toward the Mercy's edge. Viren roared in fury and ordered his soldiers to seize her. But even as they grabbed her arms, Lyra smiled. The beacon was already transmitting the antidote formula to her ship. Even if she died here, the cure would reach the surface. Then something unexpected happened. A communication came through the fortress speakers. The human frigate Mercy's Edge had arrived at Velar Prime. Captain Orin was demanding Lyra's immediate release. Vryn's eyes narrowed with hatred. He refused to negotiate with inferior species. He ordered the fortress weapons to target the human ship. The battle for Velar Prime had begun, and Lyra was trapped in the heart of the enemy fortress, holding the cure that could save thousands of lives. The distress signal that made humanity fearless. She seized their fortress before the antidote part. For the fortress shook as weapons fire erupted in the space outside. Through the metal walls, Lyra could hear the distant thunder of pulse cannons and the high-pitched whine of energy shields. The battle between the Mercy's Edge and the Ironbound had begun. Kreth soldiers held Lyra's arms in iron grips. The antidote container pressed against her chest, still clutched in her hands. She refused to let go. Even if they broke her fingers, she would not release the cure. Executor Vryn stood before her with cold fury in his eyes. He demanded to know how one human had gotten so far into his fortress. He demanded to know how she had bypassed his security systems. He demanded answers. Lyra said nothing. She simply stared at him with quiet defiance. Vryn's mandibles clicked with irritation. He ordered his soldiers to take the container from her by force. The guards reached for her hands. Then a voice echoed through the corridor. Kethfor stepped out from the maintenance room, his forearms raised in surrender. He admitted that he had helped the human. He had disabled the security locks. He had guided her through the lower decks. The failure was his, not the soldiers guarding the vault. Vryn's attention shifted to the young technician. His eyes filled with a hatred deeper than anything he had shown Lyra. Traitors were worse than enemies in Kreth culture. They represented the ultimate failure of loyalty and obedience. He asked Kethfor why he had betrayed his own people. He asked, what could possibly justify such dishonor? Kethfor stood straight despite his obvious fear. He said he had watched the commanders celebrate when the weapon was deployed. He had seen them laugh while thousands died on the planet below. He had realized that this was not strength. This was cruelty. And cruelty was not something he could serve anymore. Vryn raised his hand to strike the young Kreth down. But before he could move, another explosion rocked the fortress. The lights flickered. Warning alarms screamed from every speaker. A damage report came through the communication system. The human frigate had scored a direct hit on the weapon platform's captain. Orin's voice crackled over the open channel. He announced that medical shuttles were launching toward the surface. The antidote formula that Lyra had transmitted was being synthesized aboard the Mercy's Edge. Within hours, the cure would reach the infected populations. Lyra felt tears forming in her eyes. She had done it. Even if she died right now, the Veluxi would survive. The children would live. The families would stay together. Her mission was complete, but Vryn was not ready to accept defeat. He grabbed Lyra by the throat and lifted her off the ground with terrifying strength. His claws pressed against her skin hard enough to draw blood. He told her that she had won nothing. Even if the surface was cured, he would destroy the human ship. He would hunt down every member of her crew. He would make humanity pay for this humiliation with centuries of suffering. Lyra could barely breathe. The world was turning gray at the edges of her vision. But she forced herself to speak. She said that killing her would change nothing. Other humans would come. They would always come. Because that was what humans did. They showed up for strangers. They fought for people they had never met. They refused to let evil win. She asked him if he understood what that meant. It meant that Kreth could never truly conquer humanity. They could destroy cities and burn worlds, but they could never break the human spirit. Because that spirit lived in every human being waiting to be awakened by the suffering of others. Vryn's grip tightened. He was going to kill her. Lyra could see death approaching in his cold eyes. Then Kethfor threw himself at the executor. The young technician had no combat training. He had no weapons. He simply crashed into Vryn with all his weight, knocking them both to the ground. The impact forced Vryn to release Lyra. She fell to the floor, gasping for air. The antidote container rolled from her hands. Guards rushed to restrain. Kethfor, they pinned him to the ground with brutal force. Vryn rose slowly, his pride wounded more than his body. He looked at the young Kreth with pure murder in his eyes. But before he could act, something remarkable happened. Other Kreth began appearing in the corridor. Technicians and engineers from the lower decks, young soldiers who had been listening to the confrontation through the internal communication system. They stood in silence, watching their commander with uncertain eyes. One of them spoke. She was a young female Kreth with pale shell markings. She asked if what the human said was true. She asked if humans really risked their lives for strangers. She asked if that was why this woman had come alone into their fortress. Vryn ordered her to be silent, but she did not obey. Instead, she asked another question. She asked why the Kreth could not be like that. She asked why they had to destroy instead of heal. She asked why strength always had to mean cruelty. More voices joined hers. The young Kreth were speaking openly, something that had never happened before. They were questioning their commander. They were questioning their entire culture. Vryn screamed at them to return to their posts. He threatened execution for everyone who disobeyed. His hand moved toward his weapon, but the soldiers guarding the vault did not move to support him. They stood still, their rifles lowered. They were watching Kethfor on the ground and Lyra struggling to breathe. They were seeing something they had never seen before. They were seeing someone willing to die for. What was right? Vryn realized he was losing control. His authority depended on fear and absolute obedience. But fear was failing him now. These young Kreth had found something stronger than fear. They had found doubt. And doubt was the beginning of change. He raised his weapon to shoot Lyra himself. If he killed the human, maybe the spell would break. Maybe his soldiers would remember their training. Kethfor shouted a warning. The pale female Kreth moved to block the shot. Other young Kreth stepped forward as well. They formed a barrier between Vryn and his target. For the first time in his life, Executor Vryn hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, another explosion tore through the fortress. The ceiling collapsed in the corridor behind them, cutting off any retreat. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut. They were all trapped together now. The commander, the traitor, the human, and the young Kreth, who were beginning to question everything they had ever believed. The battle outside continued to rage. But the real war was happening inside this corridor. It was a war for the soul of an entire species, the distress signal that made. Humanity fearless, she seized their fortress before the antidote Part 5. The corridor was filled with smoke and the smell of burning metal. Emergency lights cast everything in shades of orange and red. Debris covered the floor where the ceiling had collapsed. The group was trapped between fallen wreckage and sealed bulkheads. Executor Vryn stood in the center of the chaos, his weapon still raised. Around him, young Kreth soldiers and technicians watched with uncertain eyes. They had never defied a commander before. They did not know what would happen next. Lyra pushed herself to her feet, her throat still burning from Vryn's grip. She looked at the young Kreth, who had formed a barrier to protect her. She saw fear in their eyes, but also something else. Hope. They wanted to believe that a different future was possible. Vryn's voice cut through the silence. He called them all traitors and fools. He said they had been corrupted by human weakness. He said they had forgotten what it meant to be Kreth. Strength was everything. Power was everything. Those who could not accept this truth deserved to die. He aimed his weapon at the pale female Kreth, who had spoken first. She was young, barely an adult by Kreth's standards. She had questioned him in front of everyone. Such disrespect could not go unpunished. Kethfor struggled against the guards holding him down. He begged Vryn to stop. He said killing her would prove nothing. It would only show that the commanders were afraid of questions. True strength would answer those questions instead of silencing them. Vryn laughed coldly. He said strength did not need to answer to anyone. Strength simply acted. That was the lesson every conquered world had learned. That was the lesson these young fools would learn now. His finger tightened on the trigger. Lyra stepped forward. She put herself between Vryn and his target. She said he could shoot her instead. She was the one who had caused all this trouble. She was the one who had invaded his fortress and stolen his antidote. If he needed to kill someone, she was the obvious choice. Vryn hesitated. The human confused him. She had no weapons, no armor, no way to defend herself. Yet she kept putting herself in danger for others. She kept offering her life like it meant nothing. He could not understand such behavior. He demanded to know why she would die for a Kreth she had never met. They were enemies. Their species had nothing in common. Why would she sacrifice herself for someone who is not even human? Lyra smiled sadly. She said that was exactly why she would do it, because compassion was not limited to those who looked like her or spoke her language. Compassion extended to everyone who was suffering. Everyone who was afraid, everyone who needed help. She told him that humans were not special because they were strong or smart or powerful. Humans were special because they chose to care. They chose to fight for strangers. They chose to believe that every life had value, even the lives of their enemies. That was what made humanity fearless. Not the absence of fear, but the decision that some things mattered more than fear. Vryn stared at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his eyes. For just an instant, he seemed to truly see her. Not as an enemy or a specimen, but as a person willing to die for her beliefs. Then the moment passed. The cold hatred returned. He said her words were meaningless. Compassion was weakness. The Kreth would never accept such foolishness. He raised his weapon again, but this time, the guards did not support him. The soldiers who had been holding Kethfor released him and stepped back. Other guards lowered their rifles. The young technicians moved closer together, forming a united front against their commander. One of them spoke. He was an older soldier, scarred from many battles. He said he had followed orders his entire life. He had killed without question because that was what soldiers did. But today he had watched a human walk alone into their fortress to save strangers. He had watched her offer her life for a young Kreth she had never met. He said he could not remember the last time a Kreth commander had shown such courage. He said he was tired of serving leaders who only knew how to destroy. He wanted to serve something better. Others added their voices. They spoke of dreams they had hidden for years. Dreams of peace instead of war. Dreams of building instead of burning. Dreams of a future where strength meant protecting the weak instead of crushing them. Vryn screamed at them to be silent, but his voice was drowned out by the chorus of dissent. For the first time in Kreth's history, soldiers were openly refusing their commander. The pale female Kreth picked up the antidote container and handed it to Lyra. She said the human had earned this. She said she hoped that someday the Kreth could be worthy of such courage. Vryn raised his weapon one final time. But before he could fire, the bulkhead behind him exploded inward. Coalition soldiers poured through the opening, followed by Captain Orrin himself. The captain had led a rescue team through the damaged sections of the fortress. They had fought their way to Lyra's position using her beacon signal. When they saw the scene before them, they stopped in surprise. A human woman stood surrounded by Kreth, but none of them were attacking her. Captain Oren asked Lyra if she was all right. She nodded and held up the antidote container. She said the mission was complete. The Veluxi would live. She also told him that not all Kreth were enemies. She gestured to the young soldiers and technicians around her. She said these people had risked everything to help her. They deserved protection, not punishment. Vryn tried to rally his loyal guards, but there were none left. He stood alone in the ruined corridor, surrounded by the rebellion he had created through his own cruelty. Coalition soldiers restrained him without resistance. The battle outside was ending. The Kreth fortress had suffered too much damage to continue fighting. Shuttles were already landing on Velor Prime, carrying the antidote to the infected populations. Thousands of Veluxi would survive because of what happened today. As Lyra walked toward the rescue shuttle, Kethfer called out to her. He asked if she would keep her promise. He asked if she would tell the galaxy that some Kreth wanted peace. Lyra turned back and looked at the young technician, who had risked everything to help a stranger. She told him she would do more than that. She would make sure the galaxy knew that courage could be found anywhere, even in the heart of an enemy fortress. She would tell everyone that change was possible when people chose compassion over cruelty. The news of what happened spread, crossed known space within days. A single human woman had walked into an enemy fortress unarmed and emerged with the cure that saved thousands of lives. She had inspired a rebellion among young Kreth soldiers. She had proven that the human spirit could not be conquered. Messages poured in from dozens of species. They asked the same question that Vryn had asked. How did humans find such courage? How did they face impossible odds without breaking? Lyra gave the same answer to everyone who asked. She said humans were always afraid. They felt fear just like any other species. But they had learned something important over thousands of years of history. Fear was just a feeling. It could not stop you unless you let it. The only thing that mattered was what you chose to do when you were afraid, and humanity had chosen. Long ago, to face their fears together, to fight for each other, to never abandon anyone who needed help. That was the legacy Lyra carried with her. That was the truth she had shown the galaxy. Humans were not fearless. They were simply unwilling to let fear control them, and that made them the most dangerous species in the universe, not because they could destroy, but because they refused to stop caring, even when caring might get them killed.